Isaac Newton, discoverer of the law of gravity, uses it as an argument for God. Stephen Hawking, genius, working on gravitation, uses it as an argument for atheism. And I thought, how do you get from one to the other?
You're about to hear Dr. John Lennox give a brilliant presentation about science and God, and then he's going to explain why some of the most brilliant minds in history, like Stephen Hawking, Richard Dawkins, and among others, reject the notion of God. And be sure to at least stick around until you hear his analogy about Henry Ford and the motor car, because if you understand that, you will be way ahead of the curve. Let's get into it.
Can you be a scientist and believe in God? Can a real scientist, are you always going to be a lousy scientist if you believe in God?
Good question.
Well, I think there are two examples of the contrary sitting in front of this audience. The relationship between science and God is a very deep one, actually. And even asking that question can show that we don't know much about our history, because science, modern science, is really a gift of the biblical worldview to the world. You think back of the pioneers of modern science. So you start with Galileo, and then you've got Kepler, Newton, and you come on up through Faraday, Clark Maxwell, and so on. All of them were believers of God. And C.S. Lewis put it very succinctly when he said men became scientific. Why? Because they expected law in nature. And they expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator. So that's the first thing that brings them together in my mind. And what I discover is that the scientific endeavor, the motor that drove it, actually, originally, was faith in God, because it was belief in a rational creator, meant that it was natural as part of worship of God to study that creation. I was just a couple of weeks ago in Prague, and I was talking to them about Johannes Kepler and how he said that God had written the way in which the world works in the language of mathematics, that kind of thing. And that has always been a great inspiration to me. So I'm not slightly the least embarrassed in being a scientist and a Christian, because, as I put it, it was science, it was Christianity that arguably gave me my subject. And one of the deep things about this was, if you think of Kepler, what happened is fascinating. He became the imperial mathematician in the 17th century in Prague. And he was working with the Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe. And Brahe was a brilliant observer. And he was observing the orbit of Mars. And he put Kepler to work and said, you've got to develop some way of understanding this in terms of circular motion, because Aristotle had said centuries before that perfect motion is circular. And so the heavens above the moon are perfect, so they must be circular. So here was Aristotle's worldview being imposed on science. And what Kepler did was step out of that. He said, it doesn't work. I can't fit it. So what I'm going to do is listen to the universe and see what it says. And very rapidly, he came up with the idea that the planets moved in equally perfect ellipses round the sun. And that was a profound move, because what it is really saying, that he believed the universe is contingent. That is, God can create it any way he likes. And if you want to find out, you go and look. And that is the genuine scientific attitude. And when these people discovered things about the universe, they didn't say, oh, wonderful, we now know the law of gravity, and you can deduce the planetary motions from the law of gravity. We don't need God. None of them reacted like that. Isaac Newton actually said, what a genius God is to do it that way. In other words, he didn't believe in a kind of God of the gaps. I can't explain it, therefore God did it. It was what he understood of the workings of nature that were evidence of God's working. So that's where I
I will note real quick that there is a case where Isaac Newton did fall for the God of the Gaps error when he proposed his idea that the formation and placement of the stars and the planets was solely responsible from the direct divine intervention of the hand of God. But later, a French physicist went on to disprove that and found a very plausible explanation for the purely physical origin of the location of the stars and the planets, which is very similar to the prevailing theory that we have today to explain that. But as Lennox is saying, this specific instance that he's talking about here is not a God of the Gaps error. Let's get back into it.
I'd start that.
Well, then how did we go from Newton to Hawking? They had kind of different views.
They had kind of different views, yes. It always intrigued me, and it's a big question I asked myself. Isaac Newton, discoverer of the law of gravity, uses it as an argument for God. Stephen Hawking, genius, working on gravitation, uses it as an argument for atheism. And I thought, how do you get from one to the other? And it seems to me that there's a lot underneath this that I can explain as follows. I think Hawking, he was a brilliant mathematician, and I'm not saying this, one of our greatest contemporary scientists, Lord Rees, the astronomer, said this, that Hawking was a hopeless philosopher. In fact, in his book, The Grand Design, which is fascinating because he, like everybody else, sees that the universe gives an impression of design, and yet he tries to explain it away. And I want to argue that Hawking made this mistake. Why? Because he had a false understanding of science. Now, that's a pretty big thing to say of a world-famous cosmologist. And secondly, he had a false understanding of God. Let me address the first one and two of them, if you don't mind, briefly. Think of science. I like to put it this way. Why is the water boiling? Well, because heat energy is being transmitted through the copper sides of the kettle, and it's agitating the water molecules and it's boiling. That's why it's boiling. Well, yes, it is, but it's also boiling because I want a cup of tea. Now, think of those. Those are two different explanations, aren't they? But think of them. They don't conflict. They don't compete. They complement each other. And in fact, outside the lab, the tea explanation is by far the most important. People have been enjoying tea for millennia before they knew anything about heat transfer. Now, the interesting about that is, let's extrapolate that up to the size of the universe. You see, Hawking says explicitly, you've got to choose between science and God. You can't have both. And I wondered about this for years. How could you possibly say that? Well, you can say it if you think that the God explanation is the same as the scientific explanation. Dawkins believes that. So one excludes the other. But you see, working on the basis of that illustration I've said to you, I can put it this way. God no more competes with science as an explanation of the universe than Henry Ford competes with automobile engineering and physics as an explanation for the motor car. They're different kinds of explanation. One is in terms of science, law, laws of nature, and so on. The other is in terms of an agent. It's a totally different kind of explanation. And a lot of heat is taken out of the so-called science-God tension if we realize that. To sum that up, science tends to answer the questions, how does this work? And why a function? Why is that bit there, etc. It doesn't answer the question, why of purpose. That can only be answered in terms of an agency. And to have a complete explanation, you need both. And
it is so important to understand that idea that John Lennox just laid out there, with those two analogies. If you get nothing else away from this video, please remember this part. And if you didn't quite understand what he's putting down there, please rewind to understand it. Because back when I was an atheist, I did not understand completely what he's saying here. And my belief in science completely turned me off to the possibility of an existence of a divine creator who designed and formed our universe. And so with that being said, I'm going to save the rest of my thoughts for the end of the video. Let's get back into it.
What I contend for is we need to think seriously about what it means to explain. You see, when I went to school, some of my teachers weren't very good, and I was taught that the law of gravity explained gravity. But it doesn't. Newton realized that, but he put it in Latin. That's why people don't know it. He said, non fingo hypothesi. I don't make hypotheses. I don't pretend to know what gravity is. No one today even knows that. Now, if you don't believe that, read Richard Feynman, one of your finest physicists of the last century. What he did was he found the law of gravitation, which enables you to do calculations accurate enough to put a man on the moon. But it doesn't tell you what gravity is. So that explanation only tells you part of the story. It's very important to realize that, even within science itself. Now to the second part. Choose between science and God. Well, there are different kinds of gods. And unfortunately, Stephen Hawking, like Dawkins, got mixed up in his gods. And what he's thinking of, and it took me a long time, I'm afraid, I was a bit slow in the uptake to realize that often their concept of a god is the Greek concept. People didn't understand lightning or thunder, so they postulated a god of lightning and thunder. And then you come to Rice University, you take atmospheric physics 101, and those gods disappear very quickly. So science has got rid of lots of gods, and a good thing too. But you see, the God of the Bible is not a God of the gaps. We can't explain it, therefore God did it. I sometimes say to people, have you read the first statement in the Bible carefully? It goes like this. In the beginning, God created the bits of the universe we don't yet understand. Well, it doesn't. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That is everything. The bits we do understand, the bits we don't. And I've already said that Newton's reaction was the bits that we do understand give evidence of God, of an intelligent creator. Just like if you understand something about art, you will see much more in the genius of a Rembrandt or a Picasso than I can see, who know nothing about art. The more you understand, the more you admire the genius of the person behind it. And suddenly I realized that what Hawking was doing is saying that you've got to choose between science and a Greek god. That's a totally different question. And you see, they have the habit of saying, I had a debate in Oxford with a number of people. Dawkins was there, but he didn't debate. And it was put to me rather cynically that I was an atheist. And the explanation was, well, Lennox, you're an atheist with respect to Baal, Zeus, Astarte, and all these gods. And I admit I am totally atheistic with regard to all of those gods. And then Michael Shermer, who was the person there, he gave a big smile and said, we just go one god further. And we add Jehovah to the list. He hasn't a clue about the ancient gods. But there are people that have a clue. Werner Jaeger, world expert in Oxford on the Greek gods, said this. Listen carefully. He said the difference between the Greek, Babylonian, Assyrian gods and the biblical God is this, that those ancient gods were descended from the heavens and the earth. They were products of the chaotic creation. The God of the Bible created the heavens and the earth. There's a massive difference, and science doesn't displace that God. In fact, if God hadn't created the universe and scientists, there'd be nothing there to study, and there'd be no scientists to study it. So it seems to me that we can answer this question, how do you get from Newton to Hawking, you get there by making fundamental mistakes about the nature of science and the nature of God.
But not everybody makes these same mistakes that John Lennox is talking about revolving around science and God. But there are still many people, very intelligent, brilliant scientists, and people like you and me who don't believe in God. And it could be for many reasons, but a big one that held me up as an atheist myself was the thing doing with the miracles. Seeing all these miracles in the Bible. I mean, I've never seen a miracle with my own eyes, not like the ones described in the Bible. You know, the seas getting split in half, people inside being swallowed and surviving inside of whales, just duplicating bread out the wazoo. Like, these are things that you don't see and that science, I haven't seen explain. So I tossed out the whole Bible. Nah, it's not true. It's fake, or it's man-made, or it's lying, or something like that. But there's one big flaw I was missing, and it's that science cannot prove that miracles don't exist, because miracles are a supernatural phenomenon, and science can only explain natural phenomenon within the natural grounds. Can't explain that supernatural stuff. So if you hold that miracles don't happen, there's also a hidden premise in that, which says that there is not a God that can perform miracles. And for you to reasonably hold that view, you'd have to disprove that a God exists. But God can't be disproven. So this now becomes an article of faith. It's a belief that is held and no longer some scientific presupposition that we can identify with evidence and test. Because miracles, they don't have that natural element. They are supernatural by nature. But hold on a second. Just because miracles are possible does not mean that they're probable or even likely at all, right? This argument can seem pretty compelling at first, but there's one big flaw in it. And it's that probability must be determined in context of the worldview and the situation. If you hold that there is not a God that can perform miracles, a supernatural explanation for an event that's called a miracle is extremely unlikely, if not impossible. But if you hold that there is a Christian God who performed miracles then, who's also performing miracles now, it is very likely that it would be a miracle. If not, it is even expected that there would be miracles. If there isn't, we'd be concerned about the Christian God. So the skeptic must prove that the God doesn't exist, but that can't be done. So there's not really a basis for claiming that miracles are not possible or even probable. But this is just one point of contention, and many people have many reservations about God. So if you want to learn more about the evidence supporting God, please check out the video on screen right about there. And please let me know. Let's talk about this in the comments below. I've been just loving the conversation that we've been having down below. So much love and support, and also critical thinking, which I really like. And with that, have a good day.